However, upon reaching the battle area, the screening forces were to be split off. A novel formation was worked out that was designed to provide the maximal amount of warning time to the carriers of incoming enemy air attacks, even at the expense of the fleet's battleships. The carrier division was to be preceded by a scouting line of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that would be placed anywhere from 100 to 200 nautical miles in front of the carriers. These vessels were to be arranged in line abreast, spaced apart roughly at the limits of visual range. In addition to giving earlier warning of enemy aircraft, the scouting line also placed the eyes of the fleet, the cruiser and battleship scout planes, in the van, where they could find the enemy more easily. In addition, it was felt that a widely distributed van formation would aid search aircraft attempting to return to the fleet when all ships were operating under conditions of radio silence. A friendly plane had a good chance of running across at least one of the vessels in the van, which could in turn direct it to its mothership. Finally, the heavy units in the van itself could be used to attack enemy units with gunfire that had already been damaged by dive bomber attacks, thus augmenting the ship-killing power of the fleet as a whole. The proposed formation was not without its share of critics. It was recognized that the ships in the van were likely to absorb damage for the carriers. While this was not an official function of the van, it was apparent enough to the officers who would command the vessels located there, eliciting criticism that they were nothing but sacrifices for the carriers. Furthermore, it was felt by some that the detachment of the van units left the carriers less well screened than they ought to have been. Conversely, the lack of screening units might be compensated for by a lessened chance of being attacked in the first place. Given that the carriers were almost solely responsible for providing their own flak in any case, this rationalization may not have been as far-fetched as it appears. It was also hoped that the installation of radar would aid the fleet's air defences still further. However, the very shape of the screening dispositions betrayed a lack of understanding of radar's potential in anti-air warfare. As it happened, these new plans had just been agreed upon in principle by Third Fleet staff when the campaign at Guadalcanal burst forth unexpectedly. News had come in on Friday 7th of August that the islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal had been heavily attacked and that American carriers were operating off the islands. Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo all sorted for Truk, with the intent of battling the Americans immediately thereafter. Third Fleet staff's plans were so new that their doctrinal concepts hadn't been distributed to Admiral Nagumo's ships before they left. It was hoped that the fleet's staff would have time to go over them at Truk. However, as events transpired, Cardiff I didn't even call at Truk before heading to what would later be called the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. To get the plans to Nagumo, a naval aircraft flew them out to the carriers and delivered them by hand. No time was available for any training exercises. As a result, Third Fleet's new doctrine had little impact on the battle itself. The tale of Third Fleet's doctrinal developments is a fitting place to end our narrative, because it is a parable for how the Imperial Navy would fight the remainder of the Pacific War a day late and $1 short. Third Fleet's efforts at self-appraisal were honest, and their resulting doctrine contained some useful elements. If nothing else, the Navy's new battle plan finally placed the aircraft carrier at the apex of its naval hierarchy and sought meaningful ways for the fleet's heavy units to contribute to the success of the carriers, rather than the other way around. But these efforts were completely eclipsed by the speed with which the Americans had gone over from the defence to the offence. Their ability to launch a counter-offensive in a theatre of operations as far-flung as the Solomon Islands was truly stunning and caught the Japanese completely by surprise. From now on, it was the Americans who would hold the initiative. The Japanese would still win tactical victories, but for all their efforts, they would never be able to reassert any meaningful influence over the flow of strategic events. In the end, Third Fleet's efforts would not be remembered as being a key element in the resurrection of Japan's carrier force. Rather, it would be nothing more than a footnote in the coming tale of the total ruination of the Japanese Navy. Part 3. Reckonings. Even 60 years on, correctly identifying the reasons for Japan's defeat at Midway is not a simple task, because the battle defies simple answers. Indeed, the scale and complexity of the struggle result in a host of possible reasons for the catastrophe. Unfortunately, many of these reasons turn out to be proximate rather than root causes. Yet, if any lessons are to be gained from history, the true sources of failure must be uncovered. It is to a careful consideration of these issues that we now turn. This quest will necessarily set aside the more prominent reasons on the American side for their having won the battle. Code breaking, of course, stands at the top of the list, and Admiral Chester Nimitz's bold leadership, as well as strong performances by Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, played important roles. Finally, the individual skill and bravery of the American sailors, airmen and Marines involved in many cases provided the difference between victory and defeat. But all of these were factors beyond Japan's control, and it is safe to say that even despite these virtues, the Americans could not have won the battle without the unwitting assistance of their foes. Given the disparity in the naval forces then available in the Pacific, Midway was truly the Imperial Navy's to lose. Why did they do so? An appropriate place to begin the search is with the contemporary Japanese perspectives on the matter. Before Admiral Kusaka ever set foot on board Yamato on 10th of June, he had clearly been doing a great deal of thinking on the reasons for the defeat. Inevitably, given his proximity to the battle and his ignorance of American code-breaking activities, some of his conclusions were valid, some less so. In Kusaka's opinion, the Nagumo forces' fog-bound radio transmission on the 2nd might well have led to their detection. Kusaka also noted that the aerial searches on the eastern flank of the force were not commenced early enough and should perhaps have been launched before dawn. The fact that all 4 of Nagumo's carriers were slated to carry out attacks on Midway, as well as holding forces in reserve, Kusaka felt, led to confusion when the initial sightings of American carriers were reported. He also bemoaned the lack of fighters for the second attack wave, although we know in retrospect that this is questionable, and that concentrating the force's carriers meant they were caught in a group. Admiral Ugaki, in his own personal diary, endorsed some aspects of Kusaka's analysis, such as the disadvantages associated with tactical concentration of the force's carriers. He noted, too, the lack of adequate reconnaissance. However, Ugaki was less concerned with Nagumo's scouting at the tactical level than he was with the failure of Operation K, which left the departure of the American carriers from Pearl Harbor undetected, and the fact that the heightened state of alert on Midway itself had not been adequately understood. He noted that the sheer size of the operation and the distribution of the forces was such that Nagumo could not be rapidly reinforced when needed. Ugaki also rightly harbored doubts concerning the security of Japanese plans. Whether the Americans had detected Japanese forces as they sortied from bases like Saipan, or the northern forces had been sighted by a Russian merchant ship, or Japanese radio security had simply been inadequate, Ugaki did not know, but his suspicion about these questions was not lacking. Finally, Ugaki conceded that the main cause for the defeat might have been that we had become conceited because of past success, and thereby failed to anticipate the steps that might need to be taken if an enemy air force should appear on Nagumo's flank. As we shall see, the Imperial Navy's hubris before the battle is a theme that has resonated with historians down to the present day, and for good reason. Fuchida Mitsuo, writing shortly after the war, expanded on the theme of overconfidence, ascribing it to what he referred to as victory disease, shribi, a fatal conceit and sloppiness born of contempt for the enemy. Beyond such moral failings, Fuchida also expounded a litany of faults in other aspects of the operation, including a lack of strategic intelligence on American actions and faulty scouting arrangements both before and on the day of the battle. To these were added the dispersion of Japanese forces, caused by a failure to maintain focus on the primary objective of the operation, the destruction of the enemy fleet. Instead of keeping this goal unequivocally fixed as the foremost aim of the operation, Combined Fleet allowed its plans to be driven by an undue emphasis on securing the best possible meteorological conditions for the Midway landing operations. Fuchida also commented on the technological backwardness of the Imperial Navy, as manifested by its lack of radar, and its continuing reliance on the battleship as the arm of decision. At the level of command, Fuchida also rightly contended that Admiral Yamamoto's insistence on directing the operation from onboard Yamato had hampered his control of the battle. Admiral Nagumo, in turn, was faulted for failing to enforce adequate search dispositions on the morning of the Midway strike. More questionably, though, Fuchida cited the admiral for failing to use a two-phase search, as well as failing to dispatch a replacement for Tone's No. 4 plane instantly when it became apparent that its launch would be delayed. In this, Fuchida overlooked the fact that two-phase search techniques had yet to be incorporated into doctrine. Likewise, he ignored the fact that even had Tone's sole remaining long-range search aircraft been ready, the time required to get it on the catapult, warmed up, and into the air would hardly have been less than it actually took to launch Amari. The same criticism, of course, applies to any notion of replacing the cruiser Scout with an additional Type 97 from either Akagi or Kaga. Thus, the Japanese were fairly perceptive in identifying many of the proximate causes of the defeat, though obviously both Ugaki and Fuchida were totally unaware of the code-breaking activities that had played such a critical part in the American victory. Fuchida had also identified perhaps the strongest recurring emotional theme of the battle, the conceit of the Japanese. Not surprisingly, though, neither Ugaki nor Fuchida was able or willing to take their analysis further to look at organizational failings within the Navy. Admiral Ugaki did apparently offer Kusaka and First Air Fleet staff apologies on behalf of Combined Fleet Headquarters for its faults in the battle. However, this was little more than a polite nothing that reflected no real contrition or reflection on his part. Instead, the sense that one gets from Ugaki's diary is that things were very much business as usual in Combined Fleet after the defeat. There were no wrenching reassessments regarding how strategic command was exercised within the Navy. Turning to the Americans and their perceived reasons for Japan's defeat, the very technical post-war study conducted at the U.S. Naval War College rightly cited the overconfidence of Japanese forces. Likewise, Yamamoto's excessive reliance on the element of surprise in developing his plans was carefully noted. In the War College's opinion, though, a truly cardinal sin was Yamamoto's designing his plan around America's perceived intentions rather than their capabilities. In so doing, Yamamoto blinded himself to the possibility that the Americans might actually wish to fight and might therefore intentionally place themselves in a position to do so. Other American commentators have mirrored this tendency to ascribe the Japanese defeat to errors of analysis, while also picking up on the victory disease theme. For instance, Gordon Prange, in his widely read Miracle at Midway, mirrored Fuchida's opinion that the Japanese had forgotten the principle of the objective and had focused on capturing the island rather than on destroying US ships. Likewise, he echoed Fuchida's opinion that Yamamoto's commanding the battle from on board Yamato had been a mistake. Prang also correctly noted that Japan had lost the element of surprise, had dispersed its forces over too great an area, and therefore lacked superiority at the point of contact. More questionably, however, he criticized the Japanese for having failed to carry on the fight even after Hiryu's demise, asserting, Yamamoto's forces still far outnumbered and outweighed Fletcher's in surface units. Even in carriers, from his own, Kondo's, and the Aleutian force, he could have summoned 1 carrier and 3 light carriers, with a total air strength of about 50 Zeros and 60 bombers. This was air power not to be shrugged off, especially as the Japanese believed they had sunk 2 out of 3 US flat tops. Instead, following the loss of Nagumo's carriers, Yamamoto scurried homeward with his massive force like a lumbering St. Bernard, pursued by a scrappy terrier. This is folly, of course, as his analysis totally discounts the primary role of air power in the battle, as well as the fatally dispersed nature of the air assets left to the Japanese, none of which were true fleet carriers. It likewise fails to acknowledge Nagumo's aggressiveness in the afternoon of the 4th, or Yamamoto's unsuccessful attempts to lure Spruance's forces into another engagement on the 6th and 7th. Prang concluded his analysis with a rather strange admonition of Nagumo for having made Tomonaga's morning attack against Midway purpose. Prang's notion that the initial attack should have been conducted on a scale more on par with Kakuta's much smaller attack on Dutch Harbour is clearly misguided, as it violates the cardinal military principle of using the maximum practical force available so as to simultaneously increase the enemy's casualties while minimizing one's own. Walter Lord, author of the other seminal American account of the battle, Incredible Victory, placed Tone No. 4's delayed departure, as well as Nagumo's decision to rearm his aircraft for a second attack against Midway, at the top of his list of failures for the battle. Without fully understanding the dynamics of Japanese carrier operations, he understandably also blames Nagumo for not having attacked the American carriers as soon as they were detected. Lord correctly noted the rigidity of Japanese planning in that the Americans were expected to react in a scripted fashion, as well as the fatal dispersion of Japanese forces. Not surprisingly, too, he also commented on the dangerous contempt for the enemy, as manifested in victory disease. As can be seen, the majority of the reasons uncovered by both Japanese and American observers were proximate causes, with one exception, victory disease. Thus, the first task requisite with the completion of this survey of the reasons for defeat is to examine more closely this important recurring theme. It is demonstrable, though, that victory disease was only one among a considerable number of key factors in the defeat. The term victory disease is commonly used to designate the casual, overconfident mental attitude that took hold in the Japanese Navy after an uninterrupted string of victories in the first 6 months of the conflict. The resulting loss of operational sharpness and the rash of sloppy mistakes that followed are held up by many as being a fundamental cause for the defeat. The man who first popularized the phrase Fuchida Mitsuo noted that the chief symptom of the disease was simple conceit. It was the Navy's arrogant underestimation of the enemy, as well as its blithe assumption that the enemy would be taken by surprise, that led to the catastrophe. Fuchida chalked up the dispersal of forces under Yamamoto's battle plan to similar arrogance. Yet, in his opinion, the malady was more dire than many other observers noted. Victory disease, Fuchida asserted, was responsible not just for the defeat at Midway, but was the root cause of Japan's defeat in the entire war as well. Further, he felt that victory disease's root causes lay not just in 6 months of victories, but rather in the Japanese national character. Fuchida wrote that, "There is an irrationality and impulsiveness about our people which results in actions that are haphazard and often contradictory. A tradition of provincialism makes us narrow-minded and dogmatic, reluctant to discard prejudices, and slow to adopt even necessary improvements if they require a new concept." He concluded that these weaknesses rendered fruitless all the valiant deeds and precious sacrifices of the men who fought at Midway. Other Japanese veterans have commented on this phenomenon as well. For his part, Sir Dr. Chihaya Masatake acidly remarked that Midway was the most splendid defeat the Japanese Navy had scored in its history up to that date, though many defeats even more splendid were yet to come. In his opinion, the cause of that defeat was nothing to wonder about. We as good as planned for it. If we had escaped that terrible disaster on that occasion, we should have met the same fate somewhere else in the Pacific Theatre, perhaps in the course of 1942. It was something preordained. Why? Because it was visited on the Japanese Navy to penalize its absurd self-conceit. It must be admitted that the concept of victory disease has a certain appeal to it. The Japanese were overconfident going into the battle. They were guilty of ignoring the various warning signs that manifested themselves from the time of Coral Sea onward. They did underestimate the resolve and the fighting abilities of the Americans. Yet to suggest that 6 months of easy victories, or even years of hubris before the war, had proven fatally corrosive to the rational faculties of Japanese commanders from Yamamoto on down seems too simplistic. After all, humble militaries don't typically win, Indeed, before Midway, self-confidence to the point of arrogance was a crucial ingredient in Japan's victories. Thus, while the symptoms of this mental malady certainly played a significant part in the outcome, victory disease alone does not explain the breadth or the enormity of Japan's defeat at Midway. It was an important factor, but only one of several. Likewise, arbitrarily selecting a group of command decisions, and the individuals to go with them, to blame for the defeat is also too simplistic. This cuts against the grain of many military histories, since books on great battles customarily end by pointing the finger of blame at somebody, to establish responsibility for the defeat. This is not to say that there isn't ample personal blame to be apportioned regarding Midway. There is. Indeed, at a superficial level, it would be fairly easy to pick out 3 crucial personal failures, a cursory accounting of which, albeit with a slightly revisionist twist, might go something as follows. Personal failure number 1 was the inability of Chikuma's No. 1 search plane to detect the American carriers on search line number 5 between about 0645 and 0630. This stands in contrast to the conventional wisdom, which holds that it was Tone No. 4's late launch, combined with Nagumo's decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack weapons, that ultimately doomed the Japanese forces. But a careful examination of the facts shows that Tone No. 4's failings, while serious, were also somewhat immaterial to the larger issue. Likewise, Nagumo's decision to rearm, while ultimately costing his force some amount of time, was also immaterial to this same problem, namely that by 0630 the Japanese could no longer forestall the launch of the American aircraft that would crush Kid Butai. Neither Tone No. 4's late launch nor Nagumo's rearmament orders had any bearing on this fatal loss of initiative, and once lost, it is almost certain that no admiral, not Nagumo, not Yamaguchi, perhaps not even Horatio Nelson himself, would be able to get it back. The issue of Chikuma No. 1's oversight leads to the second critical failure. Commander Genda's search plan, the lack of a 2-phase search, even if it had been incorporated into Japanese doctrine at the time, had nothing to do with the case. The basic problem was simply too few airplanes and too much ocean to cover. Had more aircraft been aloft and their search sectors been overlapping, Chikuma No. 1's failure might not have been irretrievable. As it was, the breaking of a single link of the reconnaissance plan led to the complete unravelling of the plan as a whole. The final failure, of course, lies in Admiral Yamamoto's battle plan. There is no question that his operational scheme featured an overly rigid timetable and a counterproductive dispersal of forces. By making the assumption that the Americans were beaten and therefore had to be baited into fighting, Yamamoto made the crucial mistake of letting perceived intentions on the part of the Americans drive his force structure and dispositions. The plan that emerged from this flawed belief was a crazy quilt of formations and objectives, none of which were mutually supporting. When one of the legs of the table was kicked out, the entire article promptly collapsed under the weight of its own foolishness. The result was a catastrophe worthy of Xerxes at Salamis, or Tsar Alexander the Firm at Austerlitz. However, while assigning blame to particular individuals may be emotionally satisfying, in many cases it only identifies proximate causes and fails to probe the roots of the defeat. Why was Genda's search plan so scanty? Why was Yamamoto's battle plan flawed? Would a different air officer have created a better search plan for Kid Butai? And by the same token, would another Japanese admiral have created a sounder operational plan for combined fleet? As will be seen, the answer to both of these questions is probably not, or at least not in early 1942. Why is that? To resolve these issues, a closer examination of the whole nature of failure within military institutions is required, as well as a deeper understanding of the Imperial Navy's culture. To this end, important insights can be gleaned from the cogent study by Elliot Cohen and John Gooch, entitled Military Misfortunes: The Anatomy of Failure in War, which lays out a useful framework for analysing why militaries fail in battle. As Military Misfortunes points out, there has been a natural tendency on the part of both the public and historians to assign blame mostly to individuals, criminalizing military failure by indicting one or more commanders. While such an approach is superficially appealing, it often ignores deeper layers of organizational failure. Cohen and Gooch make an important point, since modern military commanders rarely exercise absolute power over their forces and are unable to survey the entire battlefield over which they exercise command. In addition, as militaries have grown more complex to tackle larger, more demanding missions, their internal systems, doctrine, training, staff operations, even how a group of aircraft is spotted and launched from a flight deck, have grown more complex as well, and thereby more prone to failure. This is certainly true of the Japanese at Midway. This is not to say that individuals did not make mistakes, but by the same token, upon closer examination, it is clear that it wasn't just Yamamoto or Genda who failed at Midway in several important ways. The entire institution of the Japanese Navy was to blame as well. Cohen and Gooch propose that all military failures fall into three basic categories: failure to learn from the past, failure to anticipate what the future may bring, and failure to adapt to the immediate circumstances on the battlefield. They further note that when one of these three basic failures occurs in isolation, known as a simple failure, the results, while unpleasant, can often also be overcome. Aggregate failures occur when two of the basic failure types, usually learning and anticipation, take place simultaneously, and these are more difficult to surmount. Finally, at the apex of failure stand those rare events when all three basic failures occur simultaneously, an event known as catastrophic failure. In such an occurrence, the result is usually a disaster of such scope that recovery is impossible. Sadly for the Japanese, Midway must join the ignominious ranks of this level of calamitous compound failure. The first of these deadly military sins, failure to learn, indicates that a military has been either unable or unwilling to adequately address the lessons of the past. This may stem from a frank inability to understand or adequately analyze what actually went wrong or right in earlier campaigns. Alternately, a military organization may be forced by tradition, politics, or other impediments to put the blinders on, thereby hampering its self-analysis and performance in future operations. Examined in this light, it is clear that the Imperial Navy's failure to draw correct conclusions from the past stemmed in large part from its crowning naval triumph at Tsushima in 1905. From that decisive victory, the Japanese drew three fundamental conclusions that would ultimately lead them to decisive defeat. First, Tsushima seemed to confirm the notion that naval power could be used to shape and control conflicts, so that they remained localized and were fought for limited objectives. The Japanese Navy's role in the Russo-Japanese War was to isolate the Korean peninsula, thwart the activities of the Russian squadrons at Port Arthur and Vladivostok, and fight a decisive battle with the main Russian battle fleet when it finally appeared near the home islands. In this role it was eminently successful, and the war was largely fought on ground chosen by the Japanese. Second, Tsushima, falsely, taught the lesson that victory at sea devolved solely from winning climactic fleet engagements. This lesson seemed inescapable, since Tsushima was one of the most decisive naval battles in history, resulting in the utter annihilation of the Russian fleet. At the negligible cost of 3 torpedo boats sunk, moderate damage to 3 capital ships and some other smaller combatants, and the deaths of 110 sailors, Japan had caused 34 of the 38 Russian vessels that entered the Straits of Tsushima to be either sunk, scuttled, captured, or interned. Over 10,000 Russian sailors were either killed or captured. Very shortly thereafter, Russia had been forced to initiate peace negotiations. If Tsushima seemed to prove anything, it was that a single battle could determine the fate of 2 antagonists. Indeed, in the Japanese view, a single battle was likely to determine the outcome of the war as a whole. Third, Tsushima implanted in the Imperial Navy the unfailing belief in the primacy of offensive factors, as compared to defensive considerations. In that battle, the superior speed of the Japanese battle line had allowed it to maneuver freely and had been critical in dictating the gunnery range to the Russians. By the same token, Japan's unorthodox adoption of relatively lightweight main battery ammunition, whose armor penetration characteristics were inferior but whose weight of explosive charge was much greater, had inflicted enormous damage to the upper works and control centers of the Russian battleships, thereby throwing the enemy line into confusion. Thus, the Japanese believed that by bringing greater firepower to bear at decisive ranges, they would be able to defeat more numerous opponents. The seeds of this dogma had already been planted during the Navy's formative years, as the Japanese naturally adopted the policies of their mentor, the Royal Navy, which advocated an aggressive attitude toward naval engagements. But Tsushima cemented the notion that big guns were the final arbiter of any naval encounter, a belief further reinforced by the clash of heavily armed battle lines at Jutland. These three lessons were later fused unhealthily with Japan's growing fixation after the First World War on the possibility of war with the United States. The Japanese understood that any such conflict would pit them against a foe whose numerical superiority was ultimately ensured by overwhelming industrial might. Seeing no way to fight numbers with numbers, the Imperial Navy fell back on the unswerving belief that quality, if wielded with superior skill and Japanese fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi, must be able to defeat quantity. From this fundamental belief flowed every doctrinal and warship design tenet in the Imperial Navy. As a result, the other traditional roles that great navies throughout history have embraced, protecting one's commerce, destroying the commerce of the enemy, and conducting amphibious landings, were strictly subjugated to the Imperial Navy's overriding need to augment the fleet's raw offensive strength. Speed, range, and firepower were everything. The problem was that none of these dictums was appropriate in the context of a global war in the Pacific, particularly a protracted one. In the matter of using naval power to limit the scope of a conflict, it is ironic that Japan's opening moves in the Pacific War had exactly the opposite effect. By attacking Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy unilaterally ensured that the scope of the war it unleashed would be unlimited. Now, instead of having to control a limited number of seaways that led to a single geographic center of gravity, such as Korea had been in 1904-05, Japan had elected to wage war across the entire expanse of the Pacific. Under these circumstances, any geographical prescription of the conflict was impossible. As for the cherished notion of creating a single decisive battle that would decide the course of the war, the Imperial Navy searched in vain throughout the conflict for such an engagement first at Midway and then elsewhere. The Japanese completely failed to understand that a power like the United States could never be brought to ruin or even to the bargaining table as the result of a single engagement, no matter how successful it was. The industrialized, massively mobilized nature of World War II ensured that protracted warfare was practically inevitable. In such a setting, nations could be defeated only after the application of levels of cumulative force and destruction that beggared the imagination. The third lesson from Tsushima manifested itself in the Imperial Navy's continuing overemphasis on offensive factors. At the strategic level, this meant that its naval force structure, while formidable in front-line strength, did not possess the characteristics needed for the protracted war it had unwittingly purchased for itself. And operationally, it meant that Japan came to Midway armed with a doctrinal outlook rigidly inclined toward the offensive. This is evidenced by Genda's eschewal of wasting air assets on scouting operations, Nagumo's obvious preference for a coordinated counterstrike against the Americans, even at the expense of speed, and the fact that Japan's warships were ill-prepared to accept battle damage and survive. All of these factors had deleterious effects at Midway. However, perhaps the most important learning failure of the Imperial Navy concerned lessons not from prior wars, but rather from the first 5 months of the Pacific War itself. At the top of this list must stand the Navy's inability to correctly perceive the underlying reasons for its success up until April 1942. Granted, the Japanese had never fought a carrier versus carrier battle prior to Coral Sea. Yet operational mass was clearly the key to its two most successful campaigns of the initial war period, Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean foray. On both of these occasions, Japan had equipped Kidbutai with every available fleet carrier in the inventory, and, in the process, had presented its opponents with an insuperable tactical problem. Japan had won not because of its racial superiority, or Yamato Damashi, but because the Imperial Navy brought more flight decks and more aircraft to the point of contact than its enemies could muster in return. By the same token, when the Japanese had attacked with marginal forces, most notably at the Battle of Coral Sea, but also in such land operations as the protracted siege of Bataan and the initial abortive invasion of Wake Island, they had found the going much tougher. One might argue that at Coral Sea, the Japanese did not actually believe their forces were going to be marginal to the task, given the anticipated level of opposition. But this merely betrays the Japanese failure to appreciate the capacity of modern carrier forces to move across vast distances and launch powerful raids deep behind the nominal front line. As was pointed out earlier, the only way for the Japanese to avoid being outnumbered and ambushed by a suddenly appearing enemy carrier task force that wasn't supposed to be there was to bring the entirety of their own carrier force to every major operation. There really was no middle ground in terms of force allocation. Thus, without realizing it, the Japanese had ironically disproved their own cherished notion of quality triumphing over quantity. Instead, quantity had arguably been the critical factor in Japan's seminal victories to date. Given that fact, bringing the entire carrier force to an operation such as Midway was absolutely imperative. An astute naval leadership would have noticed this correlation, but the Imperial Navy did not. Whether the cause was victory disease or a simple disinterest in learning lessons at this stage of the conflict, the result was a lessening of intellectual rigor in the Navy during the first part of 1942. An accurate perception of the strengths of massing many carrier decks together should have inclined the Japanese toward a policy of fighting fewer battles, but carrying a bigger stick to each. Instead, the Imperial Navy exhibited a penchant for doing precisely the opposite. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway make it clear that the Japanese Navy was going after too many objectives at once. It was dispersing its carrier assets, thereby casting aside its proven formula for victory. In the process, it was unnecessarily elevating the Navy's risk by placing irreplaceable combat assets in situations where its weaker opponent could temporarily concentrate superior numbers against them. The fault in this respect can rightly be laid primarily at the feet of Admiral Yamamoto, for it was he who had the dominant hand in crafting the Navy's strategy. Yet it is apparent that Naval GHQ played a role as well, because it was they who persuaded Yamamoto to take on operations like Coral Sea and Operation AL, both of which would detract from the overall strength that the Navy could wield against primary objectives. Not only did Yamamoto accept these extra burdens with minimal protest, but when he did argue against them, it was never because they dispersed his available carrier power, but because they did not figure into his overall conception for how a decisive battle was to be contrived. Had he been wise, he would have vigorously contested all such secondary operations as being truly dangerous to Japan's overall strategic calculus. For this reason alone, Yamamoto should never have countenanced independent operations by Cardiff 5. By the same token, Naval GHQ should not have pushed the matter. For the fundamental truth remains that had Cardiff 5 been present in its entirety at Midway, it is difficult to see how the Americans could have won, despite their superior intelligence and demonstrable luck. But neither Yamamoto nor Naval GHQ apparently realized that preservation of Japan's critical offensive mass was essential to its ability to conduct decisive battles. There is a further irony, however, in that Yamamoto and Naval GHQ's failure to appreciate the virtues of mass at the operational level was matched by an overemphasis on conservation of mass by Nagumo and his staff at the tactical level. In fact, both of these tendencies had a dire impact on the outcome of the battle. On the face of it, This seems contradictory mass should be either good or bad. But this points out the difficulty of meting out simple prescriptions for victory or defeat in this very complex battle. Had Yamamoto supplied his subordinate with true superiority of naval air power at the point of contact, it could have widened Nagumo's tactical options immensely. Likewise, had Nagumo been less concerned with launching a massed counterstrike from his 4 decks during the battle, his options would have been commensurately widened. Other opportunities for learning during the early part of the war had also presented themselves, although more fleetingly. The outcome of Coral Sea, for instance, could have been such an occasion, but for various reasons it wasn't. For one thing, after recovering from its initial fury at Admiral Takagi for supposedly failing to prosecute the battle aggressively enough, Combined Fleet's staff had then swung around in fairly short order to believing that the operation had actually been another Japanese victory. In so doing, it blinded itself to its own shortcomings, particularly with regard to having adequate forces on hand. This opportunity was complicated, of course, by the fact that the time interval between Coral Sea and Midway was so short. As such, there was scant time for the fleet to fully absorb the 2 most important tactical implications of the engagement, namely, that American carrier aviators should not be discounted, and that lone carrier divisions were not a replacement for a fully constituted Kid Butai. Yet, while it is true that the Japanese Navy was operating on an impossibly tight schedule, and that there was little time to absorb and process battle lessons, it is also interesting to note that the time period between the Indian Ocean operations and Midway hints at the start of a learning gap appearing between the 2 navies. This was a phenomenon that would become increasingly evident as the war progressed. The US Navy as an organization often, although not always, had a superior capacity for absorbing battle lessons and translating them into doctrinal and technical modifications that would aid it in future battles. For instance, the incident in the Indian Ocean, wherein a handful of British bombers succeeded in surprising Kid Butai and nearly bombing Akagi, should have been a wake-up call to the Japanese fleet that their air defense arrangements were inadequate. It is clear that the Japanese took notice of this incident. Hiryu's after-action report emphasized the need for better long-range detection capabilities against enemy aircraft. Yet, it doesn't appear that any concerted effort was made to enhance the capabilities of the fleet's primary defense mechanism, its combat air patrol, the failure of which would doom Nagumo just 2 months later at Midway. It is true that 2 months didn't offer much time for the organizations within the Japanese Navy responsible for producing doctrine, such as the Yokosuka Air Group, to absorb the problem and produce a response. Furthermore, before the advent of radar, and in the absence of adequate ship-to-plane communications because of substandard radios in the Zero, there was only so much that could be done to improve CAP performance. Thus, complex changes in the carrier air defense arrangements certainly couldn't be expected within this time frame. By the same token, though, even some relatively simple changes at the tactical level, insisting that the fighter Shotai observe an iron discipline in maintaining their sectors and requiring them to remain stacked at prescribed altitudes, could have produced positive results at Midway. In the absence of such discipline, though, the Japanese KP operated organically and tended to overreact, thereby affording the enemy open avenues of approach. In contrast, it is striking that in the immediate aftermath of Coral Sea, Yorktown's crew was able to devise and implement a significant innovation in the area of damage control that would go on to have a major impact for the Americans. Machinist Oscar W. Myers, Yorktown's Air Department fuel officer, had observed that the demise of Lexington was the result, among other things, of an aviation gasoline fire on her hangar deck. He therefore contrived the notion of draining the fuel system after usage and filling the pipes with inert CO2 gas. Yorktown's skipper, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, was quick to give his permission to this innovation, which almost certainly prevented Yorktown's suffering a calamitous fire during Kobayashi's dive bomber attack on 4th of June. Similarly, American fighter pilots were finally beginning to come to grips with the Japanese Zero. Though the genesis of Jimmy Thatch's famous Thatch Weave manoeuvre dated from as early as November 1941, his implementation of it, albeit on a very limited scale, at Midway was symbolic of the US Navy's efforts to learn and innovate in the face of Japan's early war superiority. This is not to imply that the Japanese Navy was incapable of learning. That was certainly not the case. But it is equally clear that at this point in the war, the accumulated pressures of 6 months of defeats were forcing the US Navy to adapt frantically, and often successfully. In contrast, 6 months of victories were not creating the same imperatives within the Imperial Navy. The overall conclusion is inescapable. The Japanese Navy had a learning problem. The cherished precepts that it had carried down from Tsushima, the value of geographically limited wars, the primacy of offensive over defensive factors, and the supremacy of big-gun navies were largely inapplicable to World War II. Furthermore, at its highest levels of command, the Navy had also failed to grasp the lessons of the war they had launched. Not the least important of these principles was the overriding importance in carrier warfare of numerical superiority, despite having emphatically driven that very point home for all the world to see at Pearl Harbor. After failures of learning come those of anticipation. As Cohen and Gooch point out, the essence of a failure to anticipate is not mere ignorance of the future, for that is inherently unknowable. It is, rather, the failure to take reasonable precautions against a known hazard. Along with its failures in learning, it is clear that the Imperial Navy failed to anticipate as it went into the Battle of Midway. At the level of operational planning, Genda was clearly guilty of failing to foresee that a larger number of scouting aircraft would be required to implement a thorough search. Furthermore, his plans should have accommodated the possibility of variable weather conditions around the objective. Not only that, but as has been previously pointed out, Genda, bright and generally competent as he was the product of a military culture that emphasized the preservation of offensive mass at almost all costs. Carrier attack planes could be used as scouts during transits to the battlefield, but once battle was joined, scouting with attack aircraft was to be avoided. If there weren't enough float planes to do the job, it just didn't get done. In short, if Genda's plan was flawed, it had failed along institutionally predictable lines. More puzzling, though, is Nagumo's failure on the basis of the intelligence he had in hand before the battle, to anticipate that the American carriers might be present off of Midway. It is clear that Nagumo probably ought to have been suspicious of the level of American activity in the area, if nothing else, but he chose not to act on this intelligence. In retrospect, Nagumo's indecision was probably partly the result of his own personality, which, by this point in his career, was rigid, uninspired, and unfamiliar with the technical intricacies of the force he commanded. These tendencies were further reinforced by the military culture prevailing in the Imperial Navy, which valued conformity and obedience over creativity or personal initiative. However, as Admiral Ugaki, the U.S. Naval War College, and Walter Lord all noted, the most crucial oversight in this respect was Yamamoto's failure to take precautions against the possibility that the Americans might, in fact, be present off Midway in advance of their scripted arrival time in his battle plan. This was driven by his personal belief that the Americans were all but beaten and would need to be lured out to battle. As such, it was apparently inconceivable that they would be lying in wait. As was mentioned previously, Yamamoto was clearly guilty of the sin of planning operations around perceived enemy intentions, rather than on the basis of the enemy's likely capabilities. The corollary failure that flowed from this assumption was Yamamoto's decision to disperse his forces in the face of the enemy. By subdividing his superior mass into a welter of smaller formations that were not mutually supportive, the overall battle plan was unnecessarily weakened. Despite the plan's details having been created by his operations officer, Captain Kuroshima Kameto, as commander-in-chief, Yamamoto must shoulder ultimate responsibility for this action. Yet it is interesting to note that throughout the war, even as their strength weakened relative to the Americans, the Japanese never lost their fondness for complex dispersed operations. For instance, one of Yamamoto's eventual successors, Admiral Toyoda Soemu, created a similar monstrosity in 1944. Toyoda's Shogo-1 plan, conceived for the defense of the Philippines, featured multiple widely separated formations. 2 separate battle squadrons were designed to converge on the American invasion beaches at Leyte, while Ozawa's carrier force acted as bait to lure the American fleet northward and open the way for the battleships. Japanese operations in the early battles around Java and at Coral Sea, as well as later operations in the eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, also featured multiple Japanese formations maneuvering without the ability to mutually reinforce one another. The conclusion from this is apparent. Had Yamamoto not been in charge of Combined Fleet in April-May 1942, whoever was commanding Rengo Kantai would likely have introduced a comparable level of complication into what ought to have been a relatively straightforward exercise. Complex operations were endemic to the Imperial Navy, not just Yamamoto. This love of intricacy can be clearly detected in the 1920s and 1930s, when Japanese doctrine and fleet exercises envisioned elaborate encircling maneuvers, often taking place at night, unfolding like clockwork to trap the unwitting Americans. It is clear in this regard that Japanese naval strategy was influenced from its very inception by Oriental philosophies on the conduct of war, which emphasized the value of deception and indirect approaches. Akiyama Saneyuki, the most brilliant thinker at the Imperial Navy's Staff College at the turn of the 20th century, drew heavily not only on contemporary Western naval practices, but also on ancient Oriental military masters such as Sun Tzu, as he began hammering out Japanese naval strategic thought at that time. Akiyama's principles, in particular his love of indirect approaches so as to conceal the true objective of an operation, were seen by the Japanese as laying the strategic foundation for the victory at Tsushima. From there, they were carried forward into the interwar period, and obviously still exerted a powerful influence at Midway. Unfortunately, at Midway, the Japanese encountered a strategic problem where subtlety was a dangerous luxury. If ever a situation called for using brute force, this was it. But Yamamoto, shaped by his institutional training, adopted an elegant strategic approach that suited his service's martial sensibilities, and it is likely that any other graduate of the Imperial Naval Staff College would have done likewise. In a nutshell, Japanese naval strategy was warped and was likely to produce unworkable solutions, no matter who was in charge of the planning. In this sense, Chihaya's complaint that the Japanese Navy had as good as planned for its defeat at Midway is true, but the reasons for that defeat reached back well before 6 months of overweening pride brought them into focus. Instead, they had been built into the Navy's strategic outlook over the course of decades. One failure of anticipation, though, cannot be traced to institutional roots. This was Yamamoto's and Ugaki's high-handed behavior during the May War Games on board Yamato. Wargaming, when used objectively, is one of the most important tools at the disposal of a professional military, revealing unforeseen dangers and developing contingency plans to guard against them. In this vein, the May Games were ostensibly intended to prepare the fleet's tactical commanders for the coming operation. Yet from the very outset, Combined Fleet's Midway Games were a farce. Rather than being approached honestly and openly, the entire exercise was subordinated to the overriding political agendas of Admiral Yamamoto. The Games were merely a tool for pushing Combined Fleet's operational concepts through, no matter what objections might be raised. Late-issued operational plans and blatantly rigged officiating not only led to the sullen resignation of Admiral Nagumo from the proceedings, but also to a sense that the remainder of the participants were merely going through the motions. Thus, Combined Fleet's Commander-in-Chief willfully mishandled one of his most useful analytical tools on the eve of his most important battle. Only a single insight worthy of the name emerged from this entire exercise: the awareness that if an American carrier force appeared unexpectedly on Nagumo's flank, it could produce very unpleasant consequences for the operation as a whole. But that realization merely resulted in the issuance of a slapdash verbal instruction, namely, that Nagumo should keep half of his aircraft armed for a naval strike at all times. During the actual battle, this same instruction did little except needlessly restrict the force commander's options. Thus, Yamamoto's sole attempt to rise to the challenge of anticipating the enemy's actions was counterproductive. In sum, the Japanese Navy was clearly guilty of several crucial errors of anticipation. Genda's anemic reconnaissance scheme, Yamamoto's obtuse battle plan, even Kaga's unlikely resurrection at the hand of Ugaki during the May War Games, all were indicative of a navy that had failed miserably to foresee what the future might bring. Instead, they habitually assumed that a best-case rather than a worst-case scenario would unfold in their favor, a bad idea in military planning. Thus, the Japanese came to Midway with a flawed doctrine, having drawn the wrong conclusions from the past, and having failed to absorb the most critical lesson from the current conflict: failure 1. Moreover, their battle plan was similarly flawed and did not consider contingencies, such as the American fleet being present off of Midway, failure 2. Nevertheless, despite these glaring problems, Nagumo still might have won the battle, or at least have made the outcome more even, if the Japanese had been able to adapt to the challenge of their changed circumstances. After all, even without Shokaku and Zuikaku, the 4 carriers of Kid Butai were still the most powerful, proficient naval air force on the planet. But here, too, the Imperial Navy failed on several levels, both strategically immediately before the battle and operationally during its course. By far the most important reason for these adaptive failures was an unhealthy rigidity on the part of the Japanese regarding the sanctity of battle plans. Indeed, this is a common theme for the imperial military that can be seen not only at Midway, but throughout the Pacific War as well. Plan inertia, for want of a better term, was endemic to the mindset of the Imperial Navy, and was the result of many factors. First, while characterizing a culture in general terms is always suspect, it is probably safe to say that Japanese society prizes order above most things. Furthermore, it is demonstrable that the Japanese as a people, from the youngest to the oldest, intensely dislike making mistakes, particularly in public. Plans like social rituals are a natural way of establishing and codifying order and minimizing mistakes. This keenness on planning still manifests itself today in Japan, with many large Japanese corporations creating business plans that in some cases attempt to look into the future for decades, far longer than the 5-year horizons considered typical for large Western businesses. Likewise, while the degree of actual control Japan's post-war Ministry of International Trade and Industry, METI, had during the decades of Japan's economic miracle may be arguable, the fact that Japan was one of the few capitalist industrialized nations to engage in a systematic exercise in national economic planning is not. Not surprisingly, these central cultural tendencies manifested themselves from the very beginnings of the Imperial Navy. Furthermore, the Navy's plans had been seen as paying substantial benefits throughout that time. It was good planning that had allowed the Japanese to beat the Russians, particularly at Tsushima, but more generally through the creation of the highly cohesive, tactically homogeneous battle force that fought that war. In the same vein, the interwar Navy had put great store in policies such as the 8-8 Fleet, which sought during the years between 1907 and 1922 to create a powerful fleet of 8 new dreadnoughts and 8 battle cruisers with which to counterweigh American naval power in the Pacific. The notion of the 8-8 Fleet, the underlying rationale for which was actually fairly abstract and questionable, had become an unquestioned article of faith in the Navy up until the time the Washington Naval Treaty did away with it. This same tendency resurrected itself during the 1930s in the form of increasingly ambitious naval replenishment plans, known informally as circle plans, Maru Keikaku, which greatly expanded the power of the fleet immediately before the war. On a more day-to-day basis, the Navy's annual operational plan, Nendo Sakusen Keikaku, which was in force from 1st April to the following 31st March of each year, defined in great detail the Navy's activities for the following year. Drawn up by the Navy General Staff, The plan detailed the training to be carried out, maneuvers to be held, and the tactical problems to be solved thereby. Included in each were also detailed prescripted orders for first mobilizing the fleet, Suishi Jumbi, preparatory fleet mobilization, and then shifting it over to wartime hostilities, Nendo Teikoku Kaigun Senji Hensen, annual Imperial Navy plan for wartime organization. During any given year, of course, the Navy was expected to be devoting itself to attaining the tactical proficiency necessary to win the decisive battle, many of whose tactical precepts had become increasingly scripted and choreographed as the 1930s went on. This love of planning had paid handsome results during the opening moves of the Pacific War for both Japanese service branches. The proficiency demonstrated during the attack on Pearl Harbor is the most famous example of this. Admiral Yamamoto, and more particularly Captains Kuroshima Kameto, had taken a bold operational vision and hammered it into a sound operational plan in very short order. Pearl Harbor introduced the revolutionary use of massed carrier air power, as well as tactical innovations like the famous use of wooden fins that enabled air-dropped torpedoes to operate in the shallow waters of the harbour. No less inspired was the Imperial Army's routing of the British in Malaya, an invasion force on bicycles harrying a professional army twice its size to utter destruction in just 9 weeks, which was built around a core of solid staff work completed before the war. In the course of these planning exercises, the Japanese army had identified key overland attack routes, as well as the degree of combat engineering, particularly bridge-building capabilities, that would be required to win the campaign. All of these efforts had resulted in brilliant and well-deserved victories. Yet, too much of any good thing can have its drawbacks, and it is clear that the Japanese held their plans in such high regard that, once in place, they were loath to alter them. This manifested itself in Yamamoto's failure to adapt to the setback at Coral Sea. By not allowing Operation MI's timetable to slip, he lost the chance to include either member of Cardiff 5 in the starting lineup, and thus condemned Nagumo to fight on even terms at Midway, rather than from a position of strength. By the same token, Yamamoto's failure to adjust to Nagumo's one-day delay in sailing meant that Tanaka's invasion force was prematurely exposed to detection, which confirmed the Americans in their suspicions that Japanese carriers could shortly be expected off Midway. Neither did he adjust his plans when it became evident Operation K would fail to produce timely information on the disposition of the American fleet. At an operational level, plan inertia manifested itself in a stubborn unwillingness to adapt immediately before and during battle. Karl von Clausewitz's famous maxim that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy probably never met with a less enthusiastic audience than the Imperial Navy. Obviously, Vice Admiral Nagumo had his share of difficulties in this respect. Besides his unwillingness to act on his latest intelligence estimates, Nagumo also failed in 2 other critical respects. First, he didn't launch a quick counterstrike against the Americans when the occasion demanded. Second, by closing directly on the Americans once they were discovered, he manoeuvred his force in such a way as to expose it to greater danger than was prudent. In both of these instances, of course, he was influenced by prevailing Japanese doctrine, which favoured closing aggressively with the enemy and delivering a coordinated, annihilating blow. Yamaguchi, of course, did not adapt successfully to his circumstances either. By failing to carefully gauge the strength of Hiryu and her air group, he placed his force in an increasingly dangerous position, with little chance of commensurate reward. Yamaguchi stands as the archetypal Japanese warrior in this respect, aggressive, unwilling or unable to back down, and more concerned with preserving his own personal honour than preserving the combat assets of the nation. And as has been shown, contrary to the prevailing view of the battle, Nagumo was his co-equal in this aggressiveness, even when the long odds against his success militated strongly for an expeditious withdrawal. British Field Marshal William Slim, who had been defeated in Burma by the Japanese in early 1942, but who would later return the favour by crushing them in the same theatre in 1944, beautifully captured the spirit of his enemies in an excerpt written about the Japanese army. he remarked. The Japanese were ruthless and bold as ants while their designs went well, but if their plans were disturbed or thrown out, ant-like again, they fell into confusion, were slow to readjust themselves, and invariably clung too long to their original schemes. This, to commanders with their unquenchable military optimism, which rarely allowed in their narrow administrative margins for any setback or delay, was particularly dangerous. The fundamental fault of their generalship was a lack of moral, as distinct from physical, courage. They were not prepared to admit that they had made a mistake, that their plans had misfired and needed recasting. Rather than confess that, they passed on to their subordinates, unchanged, the order that they themselves had received, well knowing that with the resources available, the tasks demanded were impossible. Time and again, this blind passing of responsibility ran down a chain of disaster. They scored highly by determination. They paid heavily for lack of flexibility. This passage might just as easily have been written about Midway, as it perfectly encapsulates the problems the Japanese had when it came to altering their battle plans. In the matter of lack of moral courage, Yamamoto, Nagumo, and Yamaguchi were all quite clearly guilty as charged. Equally perceptive is Slim's insight that sticking with a plan, even a bad plan, was a mechanism whereby the Japanese individual could personally absolve himself of responsibility for a defeat. Too often, though, the price for doing so was needless casualties, or even the outright destruction of one's force, typically followed by the atoning suicide of the commander in question. All in all, this was not an effective model for winning a war against a numerically superior opponent. By the same token, it is clear from many of the failures of learning and adaptation just discussed that the Japanese entered the Battle of Midway wearing doctrinal handcuffs, the effect of which was to retard still further their ability to innovate. Whereas American doctrine is generally presented to a commander as a codification of guidelines concerning the effective conduct of combat, the very nature of the Japanese military culture made its own doctrine far more rigid with regards to interpretation. This manifested itself in Nagumo and Genda's disinclination to augment their tactical scouting assets with carrier strike assets, even in the face of accumulating evidence that the Americans were more alert than they ought to have been. In the same way, the apparent unwillingness of 1st Air Fleet staff to even consider splitting the attacking power of Kid Butai after discovering the Americans later in the morning originated in doctrinal imperatives. Launching a quick attack against the Americans with Cardiff II's Kanbaku before Tomonaga's recovery, difficult though this would have been to implement, might have given the Japanese their best possibility to inflict more harm on their opponent than they actually managed. Yet Japanese doctrine prescribed massed air power as the correct answer to any tactical problem that arose, and Nagumo and his staff dogmatically stuck to that formula. Likewise, Nagumo's doctrinaire decision to close directly on the Americans had the effect of leaving his fleet positioned between two hostile forces, Midway and the American carriers. A decision to maneuver more freely, either to the north or northwest, could have mitigated some of the advantages that the Americans had accrued by virtue of the superior and wholly intentional initial positioning. Despite the Japanese love of indirect approaches at a strategic level, their love of closing directly to knife-fighting range at the tactical level was never better demonstrated from the simple fact that in early 1942 the aircraft carrier was still a brand-new weapon system. As such, the body of doctrinal thinking in all the carrier navies was relatively small and still maturing. Other navies might have viewed an immature doctrine as being a tacit admission that some degree of interpretation by unit commanders would be required during the course of battle. The Japanese apparently did not see things this way. They stuck to the playbook, small as it might be. When improvisation was called for, they answered with the most expedient and transparent tactic available, charging the enemy. Thus, in the critical matter of adaptation, the Japanese likewise failed abysmally. Taken as a whole, the inescapable conclusion that emerges from a careful examination of the battle is the fact that the Japanese defeat was not the result of some solitary crucial breakdown in Japanese designs. It was not the result of victory disease, nor of a few crucial personal mistakes. Rather, what appears is a complex, comprehensive web of failures stretching across every level of the battle: strategic, operational, and tactical. Every aspect of the enterprise was tainted in some way. The surface manifestations of these deeper failures may ultimately have been a host of mistakes committed by individuals, and some of those mistakes were clearly more important than others. But the vast majority of them were in some way symptomatic of larger failures within the Japanese military and within the Navy's cultural fabric, its doctrine, and its preferred modes of combat. They were the end products of an organization that failed to learn correctly from its past, failed to plan correctly for its future, and then failed to adapt correctly to circumstances once those plans were shown to be flawed. Intriguingly, the seeds of many of these errors had been planted some 40 years before, through the initial teachings of the Japanese Naval Staff College, and from the flower of Japan's greatest victory, the Battle of Tsushima. They had lain unnoticed all that time, growing unchecked, waiting for the right time, place, and individuals to give them expression. Instead of culling these warped seedlings, the Japanese Navy had fostered their growth in the 1930s. The twin pressures of a violent nationalism, combined with the sure knowledge that they would be the underdog in any war with America, had conspired to skew Japan's naval policies and doctrine still further during that time period. As a result, by the time the Pacific War began, and despite its undoubted tactical prowess, the Navy's ability to mentally fight the war at a strategic and operational level was already fatally damaged. It was at Midway that the breadth of these shortcomings finally revealed themselves, with catastrophic results for both the Imperial Navy and the Japanese nation. Of course, in the larger context of the war, the Battle of Midway was just one of the first of a much greater harvest of bitter fruit that would fall from the poisoned tree of Japanese militarism. The military defeats that began with the Battle of Midway stem from the harsh reality that, far from being the truly modern, progressive institution that it fondly imagined itself to be, the Imperial Navy was in fact possessed of the most parochial of outlooks. Instead of the quick, limited war Japan's military leadership envisioned, the Pacific War soon revealed itself to be all-encompassing and all-consuming. In a shockingly short time, America had begun waging war against Japan across every strategic dimension available to a great industrial power: military, political, economic, and scientific. Japan was assaulted on the ground, through the air, and on and under the sea. Ultimately, it was beaten decisively in every one of these arenas. In this sense, Midway was merely symptomatic of the imperial military's larger failings. Most obvious was their fatally misguided decision to launch a war of aggression against the most powerful nation on earth. Having done so, moreover, they found themselves engaged in a conflict whose scope and complexity forced its participants to evolve at a frenetic pace. As it developed, for the Japanese this was a particularly daunting challenge. Despite the amazing speed with which they had modernized their fighting forces after 1848, they were still bound by thought patterns linked to an earlier military and cultural era, as well as the warped legacy of Tsushima. In the final analysis, it is no exaggeration to say that the conflict the Japanese military instigated in 1941 was not only beyond its resources, but also beyond its understanding. Having examined why the Japanese lost, the next step is to consider the impact of that loss. Much like identifying the true reasons for failure, evaluating the importance of the Battle of Midway is a slippery proposition. For an engagement often labelled the decisive Battle of the Pacific War, this is inevitable. Great battles by definition spawn a wealth of downstream consequences, each of which can be looked at independently. Accordingly, answers to the question, what did Midway really mean, typically come in three varieties: material, strategic, and counterfactual. The first focuses on the importance of such things as aircraft losses, the loss of skilled aircraft mechanics, and the size of Japan's pilot training programs. The second analyzes what effect the defeat at Midway had on Japan's strategy for the remainder of the war. The third seeks to illustrate the importance of Midway by creating what-if scenarios, some well thought out, some verging on the delusional, that change the outcome of the Second World War in some way, depending on the outcome of this one battle. All of these will be considered in turn. Yet, within the scope of an operational-based study such as this one, the first imperative is to consider what it meant to Japan to lose the services of 4 aircraft carriers. The question might better be phrased in terms of what it meant to lose 2 carrier divisions, in particular Carrier Divisions 1 and 2. Stated this way, the question acknowledges that the Japanese Navy had brought the concept of multi-carrier operations to a higher level of practice than any other navy. It also emphasizes that what was lost was not just X number of ships, planes, or men, but rather a well-functioning assemblage of the 3. Cardivs 1 and 2 were incredibly complex weapons systems, forged through years of training and experimentation. All the material elements composing these systems need to be considered when assessing the damage suffered on 4th of June 1942. There has been a tendency when analysing the battle to both under- and overestimate the importance of these material factors. For instance, most early accounts of the battle casually assumed that the sinking of the Japanese carriers ipso facto destroyed the cream of Japan's carrier aviators, and therefore put a stop to Japanese expansion. The truth is more complex. Works such as John Prados's Combined Fleet Decoded have corrected the record by noting that the battle itself did not signal the end of the Japanese Naval Aviator Corps. This view is directly supported by the carrier's operational records. Kaga suffered 21 aircrew deaths, both in the air and on board ship, SRI-10 and Akagi a mere 7. Hiryu's air group was the exception, suffering casualties in excess of 50%, with 72 fatalities, including her air group leader and many officers. Included with these must also be the 11 floatplane crewmen who perished. However, the deaths of 121 airmen, though painful, did not constitute a disaster in itself. In fact, Japan would lose a similar number of aviators, 110, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, and 24 more than that, 145, at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942. The losses at Midway certainly did not radically degrade the fighting capabilities of Japanese naval aviation as a whole, which probably boasted around 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrew at the beginning of the war. Rather, it would take the hellish attrition of the Solomons campaign to initiate a fatal downward spiral in Japanese carrier aircrew proficiency, with the Battle of Santa Cruz marking the effective end of the elite pre-war cadres. Prados also notes the negative effects that losing hundreds of highly skilled aircraft mechanics and technicians had on the Imperial Navy. The Midway carriers between them counted 721 aircraft technicians killed, or more than 40% of the total number embarked. These men were difficult to replace, given Japan's less mechanized society than that of its foe, the United States. Their loss, in conjunction with the large number of skilled technicians who were later to be isolated and effectively lost at Rabaul during the Solomons campaign, would have a direct impact on Japan's ability to field a modern carrier aviation force during the battles of 1944. To the toll of mechanics might also be added the deaths of other essential crewmen, such as flight deck crew, armourers, and other personnel involved in supporting flight operations. These men had trained together for years to reach the highest level of operational proficiency the Japanese Navy would ever attain. This attrition in personnel points to a more abstract loss, namely that of organisational knowledge. It is not possible simply to conjure up 3,000 men, 150 aircraft and 2 carriers, and expect them to operate smoothly. Shokaku and Zuikaku discovered this during the early phases of the war. Their tardy rearming operations in the Indian Ocean had certainly caused Nagumo considerable distress. Likewise, while recovering the final strike of 8th May at the Battle of the Coral Sea, a lack of deck-handling speed on board Zuikaku had forced the jettisoning of a dozen precious aircraft over the side in order to recover the remainder of the planes still aloft. Thus, even several months after being commissioned, it is clear that Cardiff 5 was still not operating at the same level as Cardiff 1 and 2, despite having spent much of its time in company with the veteran carriers. Eventually, Shokaku and Zuikaku would both exhibit a very high level of operational ability, but reaching that level took a long time. At a point in the war when Japan needed to be fighting as audaciously and efficiently as possible, the void left by the loss of 2 senior carrier divisions could not be filled by more junior practitioners. All of these points have merit. Aircraft were certainly precious to Japan at this point in 1942, and the collective worth of human, organizational and tactical capital must certainly be borne in mind, particularly in a war in which the Japanese so frequently squandered these important commodities. But the point that gets lost in all this is the critical significance of the flight decks themselves. It's almost as if the rush to acknowledge the importance of pilots and airplanes to the new mode of warfare has blinded modern observers to the overwhelming importance of the aircraft carrier as a strategic naval asset. Without flight decks to deliver planes and pilots into combat, the naval aviation revolution was negated because at a fundamental level, power projection absolutely requires a base from which to project it, and it was this mobile base that was by far the most expensive and least expendable component in the overall system. Japan began the war with 9 carriers. 6 of them, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were fleet carriers, large and fast enough to operate a credibly sized air group. The other 3 were light carriers, Hosho, Ryujo, and Zuiho. Of these 3, Hosho was old, tiny, and slow. Ryujo was scarcely better, being cramped, structurally suspect, and possessed of but a single suitable elevator. Of the 3, only Zuiho was truly capable of being integrated into the main carrier fleet. By the time of Midway, Japan had already commissioned and then lost Zuiho's equally useful sister, Shoho, at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japan had also commissioned Junyo and Hyo. Converted ocean liners, they were larger than the light carriers and could actually mount a decent-sized air group. However, they were possessed of cranky hybrid power plants, composed of military boilers mated with commercial-type turbines, that produced suboptimal speeds. As a result, while they were used in the role for want of anything better, they were hardly adequate replacements for true fleet carriers. The reality was that the smaller Japanese carriers could only play bit parts in the Pacific War. This is not to say that they weren't useful. They were certainly welcome additions for supporting amphibious landing operations, and they could provide a limited local air presence. But they came with many drawbacks, the most fundamental being the small size of their air groups. Carrier air groups are subject to economies of scale. They need to be large enough to scout and to supply defensive fighters to protect the mothership and still be able to deliver a large offensive punch. Delivering a single attack with, say, 32 attack aircraft is almost always superior to sending in 2 separate 16-plane attacks, because larger strike forces have a better chance of saturating the enemy's defences. Having a single carrier large enough to launch a decisive strike on its own was an important advantage in this respect. With an air group of 20 to 30 aircraft, light carriers simply did not have enough planes to go around. They could barely screen themselves, let alone deliver an attack of credible size. Furthermore, the shipboard infrastructure necessary to support the air group, repair shops, command and control facilities, fueling stations, magazines and bomb storage rooms, was also more efficiently delivered via a larger ship. Not only that, but it was easier to provide adequate escorts for a single large warship than for 2 smaller ones mounting the same number of aircraft, a critical factor in a navy as short of destroyers as Japan's. For all these reasons, deploying 2 light carriers did not produce the effectiveness or efficiency of a single fleet carrier with an air group of more than 60 aircraft. Light carriers could only complement, not replace, the functions of the fleet carriers, and with the exception of Zuiho, none of them were really worth the extra effort of slowing the fleet carriers down in order to have them around. Viewed in this light, it is apparent that the coin of naval power in the Pacific War must be measured by the number of fleet carriers available to the opposing navies. Reckoned this way, Japan started the war at something like parity with the US Navy. The USN fielded 5 large carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Wasp, to Japan's 6. By the time of Midway, the addition of Hornet had been negated by the loss of Lexington, as well as heavy damage to Saratoga, leaving the score 6-4 in favour of Japan. The number of naval aircraft carried by these respective forces only slightly favoured the Japanese, though, because of the larger American air groups. After Midway, however, the ratio was 3-2 in favour of the United States, a significant shift. The importance of these vessels is even more obvious, considering that each of them represented a phenomenal expenditure of national resources. At the time of their completion, Akagi and Kaga were by far the most expensive warships ever built for the Japanese Navy to that date, costing roughly $53 million apiece to complete. In terms of specific cost, i.e. cost ton of displacement, they were twice as expensive as a battleship of the same era. This was a result of the intricate nature of carrier design, including the provision of complex pumping and aviation gasoline systems, elaborate damage control equipment, and the emplacement of defensive guns and their associated fire control systems. In Akagi's and Kaga's cases, these costs were driven even higher by the redesign efforts necessary to convert existing capital ship hulls into functional carriers. Each had also undergone comprehensive multi-year refits in the 1930s, consuming millions more. Soryu and Hiryu, with their relatively modest price tags of $40.2 million, must have seemed like bargains when they were completed in 1937 and 1939. To these basic procurement costs, of course, must also be added the price of their air groups and the annual costs of operation. Accordingly, any analysis of the Midway battle that fails to accord the proper gravity to losing the core component of a national defense capability that was 14 years in the making, i.e. Kid Butai, utterly misjudges the nature of the Pacific War. Big carriers didn't just grow on trees. Losing 4 of them in an afternoon was tantamount to a national disaster, particularly within the time frame of the short conflict Japan hoped to fight. These losses were crushing and utterly irredeemable. One might contend that the losses in air crew and/or aircraft were of similar magnitude, but neither of these arguments is supportable. Of the two, the case for human capital perhaps has more merit, in that Japanese carrier air crewmen were, at the time, among the most highly trained aviators in the world. The airmen lost at Midway would certainly have been useful in forthcoming carrier battles in the Solomons. However, it is worth remembering that 74 of these men were killed in the air, doing what carrier airmen are supposed to do, that is, attacking the enemy or defending the fleet. Even if Japan had won the Battle of Midway with their carriers unscathed, these men would still have been dead. Only the remaining 36 were shipboard fatalities. It must also be recalled that the relatively small size of Japan's naval air corps was largely a self-imposed limitation. As a nation of over 80 million people, Japan certainly had the population necessary to develop a much larger cadre of pilots had it decided to do so. The reasons Japan chose to create an artificially small group of elite pilots instead of a larger corps of aviators who were merely very good lies outside the scope of this study. So too does Japan's failure to recognize and correct its deficiencies in this area, while there was still time to do so in early 1942. However, the fact that she was eventually able to find pilots, however poorly trained, for the 50,000 aircraft she would lose during the war establishes beyond doubt that the necessary manpower was available. Any assessment of the scale of Midway's human losses must also be measured against the backdrop of the grim combat in the South Pacific that unfolded beginning in August 1942. It was here, in the daily patrols, skirmishes, and raids that lasted until 1944, that the creme of Japan's naval air forces would be destroyed. some 2,817 naval aircraft alone between April 1942 and April 1943. Callous as it may seem, the existence or non-existence of roughly 100 carrier aircrew meant relatively little when set against this aerial meat grinder. People and planes were merely fuel for the vast furnaces of attritional combat that would soon be blazing on the southern borders of the empire. For a reader in this century, living in a wealthy country where the loss of a single multi-million-dollar fighter is front-page news, it is difficult to internalize the scale and intensity of the violence that occurred during the Second World War. Aircraft were cheap. A typical fighter cost between $50,000 and $100,000, a medium bomber roughly double that. They were produced in huge numbers. The United States built in excess of 306,000 combat aircraft during the war, Japan more than 67,000. Planes were a commodity, like trucks or artillery tubes, and were treated as such. They were consumed at frightening rates. The United States lost somewhere between 9,000 and 27,000 aircraft to all causes in the Pacific theater alone, depending on the sources consulted. Japan lost 38,000 to 50,000 during the same period. Even accepting the more conservative figures, Japan was producing a weekly average of around 350 planes, and was losing over 200 of them. Granted that in 1942 the Japanese aircraft industry was not yet producing at nearly the rate it would in 1944, but these figures make it clear that even the loss of 257 carrier planes and float planes over 3 days could be made good in a few weeks. Conversely, the carrier losses themselves were not made good on a one-for-one basis until the commissioning of Shinano on 19th of November 1944, 127 weeks after the debacle of Midway, and at a point when the war was already all but lost. A corollary to the loss of these 4 ships was the permanent loss of tactical homogeneity in the Japanese carrier force. Uniformity of operational characteristics was a central principle that had guided the Japanese Navy's shipbuilding policies since its inception, and that had served the Navy well from Tsushima onward. The 6 heavy carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor composed an exceptionally well-balanced formation. The stolid war horses of Carrier Division 1, the dashing cavaliers of Carrier Division 2, and the promising yearlings of Carrier Division 5. The pairs of ships that made up these 3 carrier divisions were well matched in terms of their speed, range, and aircraft complements. The reason for employing ships of roughly similar capabilities is simple. In the heat of battle, compensating for ships possessing widely differing capabilities introduces an unnecessary element of complexity into an already chaotic situation. Uniformity lessens command and control friction. Losing Cardiffs 1 and 2 permanently destroyed the admirable balance and integration that had existed in the Japanese carrier force. After the battle, Shokaku and Zuikaku were a solid core around which to rebuild, but Japan's inadequacies in shipbuilding meant that its 2 remaining fleet carriers would have a supporting cast of bit players, most of whom were really not up to their parts. Taiho, commissioned in 1944, was the only new fleet carrier Japan built during the entire war that was worthy of keeping company with Shokaku and Zuikaku. These 3 were the only carriers that Japan possessed during the war that were in any way comparable to the 3 American Yorktown-class carriers, let alone the dozen Essex-class carriers that followed them. The Unryu-class vessels, though worthy successors to Hiryu and Soryu, were not nearly as capable as their American opponents. The remainder of Japan's flight decks were conversions and misfits. So, despite being able to field nominally similar numbers of carriers in 1942 and 1944, Japan's carrier force never remotely approached the balance, cohesiveness, and striking power of Daiichi Kid Butai at the beginning of the war. Men and planes could be replaced, but the 4 Midway carriers could not. Their loss permanently ruined what had been the most successful Japanese naval weapon system of the war, and hence must be ranked as far and away the most important material loss of the battle. A second facet of any assessment of Midway must be the strategic consequences of having lost, which requires looking beyond mere tabulation of physical losses. The material forces of the United States and Japan were not static. They were always changing in relative strength depending on a variety of other factors: geography, weather, lines of communication, and who held the strategic initiative. Thus, H.P. Wilmot noted in his analysis of the Battle of Coral Sea that the balance sheet for the engagement had to be assessed not materially, but rather in terms of the demands made on resources by time and distance. The ability to concentrate mobile forces to dictate the direction and tempo of future operations was the all-important factor in the conduct of the Pacific War. The true cost of the battle was not to be found in calculations of ship losses, but rather in contrasting the effect of the battle on the carrier forces. This calculus applies equally well to Midway, and the true locus of that battle's downstream effects rightly lies in the waters off Guadalcanal. Japan had entered the war with the intention of eventually moving to a barrier defense backed by mobile carrier and air forces. The real litmus test of Japanese strategy was therefore to capture what was needed while preserving its strategic mass for as long as possible. As was noted earlier, the best way to preserve mass is to use it en masse instead of doling it out in penny packets. Using overwhelming force tends to keep casualties to a minimum. For the Japanese, if an objective wasn't important enough to require sending all 6 carriers, it wasn't worth going after at all. Japan violated this principle by initiating the action in the Coral Sea. She paid the ultimate price for her violation a month later at Midway. One immediate consequence of the calamity was that Operation FS, the occupation of Fiji and Samoa to cut off Australia from her lines of communication with the United States, was cancelled. Another consequence was the obviation of Japan's barrier strategy before it had truly begun. Without a powerful carrier striking force to transport aircraft to outposts under attack, the strategy was unworkable. This was illustrated when the Americans unexpectedly counterattacked at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The occupations of both Guadalcanal and Tulagi by the Japanese was both an extension of their defensive perimeter outward from the main Japanese base in the region, Rabaul, and an offensive move to apply pressure against Australia's supply lines. As such, Guadalcanal was essentially an outpost of Japan's defensive barrier in the southwest Pacific. Had the Japanese won the Battle of Midway, an American operation like Guadalcanal most likely could never have occurred, at least not when it did. However, the victory at Midway gave the Americans rough parity in fleet carriers, and enough confidence in their abilities that they were willing to fight in a remote backwater like the Solomons. Likewise, the rough parity of carrier forces of the two sides contributed to the protracted nature of the bloody struggle for the island. It is important to understand that the Japanese, while privately acknowledging the seriousness of the defeat at Midway, did not feel that they had been condemned ipso facto to fighting on unequal terms around Guadalcanal. It did not affect their strategic formulations, and it did not temper their aggressiveness. Indeed, in the short term, they were able to stay in the game in the waters off Guadalcanal. At this point in the conflict, even after the losses she had suffered, Japan still possessed the means to equip the air groups of several more fleet carriers, had the ships themselves been available. The truth of this statement is revealed in the prodigious scale of aerial resources the Japanese were ultimately able to commit to the Solomons contest, as well as the fact that Japan deployed credible air groups at various points in the struggle on board Hi, Juni, and Zui. With Shikaku and Zuikaku forming the basis of their new mobile force, and the unexpected woes of the American carriers at the hands of Japanese submarines, Saratoga was torpedoed and put out of action again from September to November 1942, and Wasp was sunk by I-19 on 15 September. The odds did not turn against Japan immediately. Of the two major carrier battles fought off Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, the Japanese lost the former but arguably won the latter. But even when they achieved what appeared to be temporary victories in the waters around Guadalcanal, they lacked the strength to capitalize on their triumphs. They could no longer close out the deal by inflicting a final crushing defeat, driving off the American support vessels and exterminating the US forces on the island. Had even Hiryu or Akagi survived Midway, which was not inconceivable, the Japanese might have had the requisite strength to prevail 4 to 6 months later in these crucial waters. Much worse lay in store after the Imperial Navy conceded defeat at Guadalcanal. By the end of 1942, the carrier forces of both sides were exhausted and depleted, leaving the remainder of the brutal fighting in the Solomons to be conducted by surface vessels and land-based air power. The carrier fleets would not meet again in battle until 1944. But by the middle of 1943, the Americans were commissioning Essex-class fleet carriers at the rate of 1 every other month, a production rate that the Japanese in their wildest dreams could never equal. With 9 very serviceable light carriers of the Independence class also having been commissioned in the same year, American naval aviation was now poised to transform the Pacific War. At the same time, not only had the Americans fundamentally altered the raw numbers in the fleet carrier equation, they had also radically transformed the intrinsic power of the individual flight decks themselves. The addition of a new generation of carrier aircraft, in particular the excellent F-6F Hellcat fighter, the improvement of air search and fire control radar, the maturation of the Combat Information Center, CIC, in combination with more effective fighter vectoring techniques, and the enormous increase in the number and effectiveness of shipboard anti-aircraft batteries, including those armed with radar proximity-fused ammunition, all meant that ship-for-ship American carriers were now markedly superior to those of the Japanese. Almost as important was the US Navy's development of a sophisticated mobile logistics capability, fast oilers and transports, repair ships, and floating dry docks, giving the Americans an unparalleled ability to forward deploy their fleet anchorages and then keep carriers operating in enemy waters for weeks at a time through underway replenishment. Not only was American naval aviation thus capable of threatening areas of the empire once thought to be off-limits, it could also maintain a much higher tempo of operations than the Imperial fleet could. So impressive was this cumulative leap in technology and operational technique that, in effect, the Americans emerged in late 1943 with an entirely new navy. All of these factors came together during the American invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. To support Operation Galvanic, the US Navy employed 6 fleet, 5 light fleet, and 7 escort carriers. The Japanese Navy had no possibility of interdicting such a powerful armada. Several of their carrier air groups had recently been transferred to Rabaul for temporary duty in stemming the American tide then rising in the Solomons. They had been chewed to pieces in the process, ruining the ability of their carriers to offer battle. The best the Imperial Navy could manage was sending a few cruisers and a squadron of submarines to the Gilberts. Just 3 months later, the Americans used a similarly enormous carrier force to crush the heretofore unassailable Japanese base at Truk. In the process, they sank nearly 150,000 tons of merchant shipping and annihilated Japanese air power on the atoll. The pattern was now set for subsequent American offensives through the Central Pacific, in which their powerful carrier task groups operated practically at will, bringing hundreds of aircraft to their objectives and destroying whatever naval opposition stood in their way. Here, then, is the crux of the matter as it relates to Midway and the larger strategic forces at play in the Pacific War. In an immediate sense, an American victory at Midway was vitally important in restoring the parity of forces in the Pacific and thereby speeding up the tempo of the war. But viewed in the longer term, the battle's strategic importance is less profound. Whether or not Kid Butai had survived intact at Midway, it is clear that the very best the Japanese could have hoped for by the end of 1943 was the ability to offer battle on terms that were merely disadvantageous rather than utterly ruinous. Even had every carrier that attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 sallied forth intact in 1943 to face the Americans off the Gilberts, the outcome there would almost certainly have been disastrous. At most, the defeat at Midway cost the Japanese approximately 18 months of strategic leverage that their 4 carriers might have bought them. But in the end, win or lose at Midway, the vast industrial resources of the United States gave its Navy an absolutely irrevocable writ of strategic dominance in the Pacific War. This leads to the third major topic to be considered answering the hypothetical question of what it might have meant for the Japanese to win at Midway. Throughout the years, the various answers to this question seen in both books and an endless stream of internet bulletin board and listserv conversations have spanned the gamut from measured to downright hysterical. Hawaii would have been captured. The west coast of the United States would have been threatened or even invaded. Australia would have been captured. America would have abandoned the Pacific and focused on Germany. Or, alternately, America would have poured yet more resources into the Pacific at the possible expense of the European theatre of action, leaving Germany to triumph over Russia and the Allies to lose the war. Japan would have eventually have been conquered by the Russians instead of the Americans. The list goes on and on. The authors, well, one of them anyway, heartily dislike alternative history. Such exercises tend to be biased from the outset and are often used disingenuously to prove pet opinions, rather than to explore openly the downstream ramifications of a given scenario. Even used honestly, they are inherently dodgy propositions. One can think of an alternative history as being a flow of changed events radiating forward from a given point in time. The problem is, the further one goes beyond the immediate implications of the changed event, the less one can predict with accuracy what might happen. That, in turn, means that there is a time threshold before which one is, at best, engaged in educated speculation, but after which one is simply indulging in largely meaningless conjecture. Alternative history can't prove anything. All it can do is suggest possible outcomes. Likewise, when someone says that the effects of the Americans losing at Midway were incalculable, they should be held to exactly that level of precision. The results of such a hypothetical loss, strictly speaking, are by definition incalculable, in that they cannot be pinned down with any exactness, pro or con. Not only that, but anyone with sufficiently deep knowledge of a given historical event can usually construct several plausible downstream scenarios from the same event that would lead to opposite ultimate outcomes. For instance, had Akagi escaped her ultimately fatal attack at 10:26, would this have turned the tide of the battle in favor of the Japanese? Perhaps, but perhaps not. One thread of argument might suggest that with one additional flight deck and a bit of luck, the Japanese could have won the battle 3 carriers to 2, forestalled or beaten the Americans at Guadalcanal, and thus held off defeat until 1946. Conversely, maybe Nautilus or some other US submarine might have gotten lucky, they were certainly due, and sunk Nagumo's flagship sometime during the early afternoon, leading to exactly the same historical outcome. The answer is completely unknowable. Nevertheless, it is impossible to write a book on Midway and not consider some of the more prominent of these hypotheses. At the very least, the question of what would have happened to Hawaii in the event of a Japanese victory needs to be addressed, as well as the likely strategic ramifications of a Japanese victory vis-à-vis the Pacific War as a whole. There's no question that the Japanese were interested in capturing Hawaii. John Stephan's superbly researched Hawaii Under the Rising Sun makes it clear that the Japanese were actively investigating such operations from the outset of hostilities, and planning continued as late as September 1942. However, the pertinent question is not whether the intention was there or not, it clearly was, but whether the Japanese ever had the military means to achieve their aims. Answering this question is relatively easy. Win or lose at Midway, the Japanese could never have taken the Hawaiian Islands under any foreseeable circumstances. The reasons are manifold and clear-cut. By April 1942, the Americans had 62,700 Army troops, 2 full infantry divisions plus support troops in Hawaii, and another 8,900 air personnel. The US Army expected this total to reach at least 115,000 ground and air personnel in the near future. This figure does not include the tens of thousands of US Navy personnel located at Pearl Harbor. Thus, even had the Japanese followed up a victory at Midway in short order with an attack on Hawaii, they would have had to contend with a Hawaiian garrison of at least 100,000, 150,000 US servicemen. These American troops were primarily located on Oahu, which was small enough to defend in depth, but big enough to maneuver on, making it an enormously difficult nut to crack. The Japanese themselves thought that capturing such a stronghold would require at least 3 infantry divisions, or roughly 45,000 troops. This was certainly a parsimonious number of troops to commit to such an undertaking, but even so, it represented an invasion force 10 times larger than the one they had planned to employ at Midway, and 3 times larger than they had ever amphibiously landed at one time. It is doubtful that Japan had the sea lift capacity to contemplate such an undertaking across nearly 4,000 miles of open water in any case. Nor is it likely that even if the Japanese had been so lucky as to have captured the islands, that they would subsequently have been able to keep their troops in supply, let alone the civilian population. Even if sufficient transport could have been found, a Japanese assault force would have landed in the face of withering American fire, without much in the way of specialized equipment and without an effective naval gunfire or air support doctrine. In the unlikely event that Japanese troops managed to gain some kind of foothold, given the size of Oahu and the depth of the American defences, there could be none of the bold flanking movements that the Imperial Army had used to such great effect in Malaya. Hawaii would most likely have to be taken frontally. Considering the heavy losses the Japanese had suffered attempting a similar landing on Wake at the beginning of the war, not to mention the appalling slaughter that American Marines would inflict on the Japanese in similar circumstances at Guadalcanal just 2 months later, the conclusion seems inescapable that a Japanese landing on Oahu would have resulted in a bloodbath worthy of the Somme. Granted, the Japanese were hardly squeamish over taking such losses, but it is difficult to see how such an invasion could have succeeded. Furthermore, the Japanese would have to secure air superiority over Hawaii with carrier assets alone. Their land-based aircraft at Midway, over 1,000 miles away, could play no real role in such an invasion. Yet unlike the carrier task forces the Americans would go on to employ in 1944, even at the height of its powers, Kid Butai never had the ability to stand off an enemy's island bastion for weeks on end and beat it into submission. In the first place, Kid Butai couldn't bring a sufficient number of aircraft to get the job done. By April 1942, Hawaii boasted 275 combat aircraft, a figure that had increased as the battle at Midway had loomed. In the event of an American defeat there, Hawaii's air force could have been augmented still further by naval aircraft shuttled in from Saratoga or Wasp, much as the Americans went on to do at Guadalcanal. This meant that Kid Butai, even with all 6 carriers available, would have fought against Hawaii from a position of numerical parity at best. But more important, the logistics for a sustained Japanese carrier presence off the shores of Hawaii simply weren't there. Kid Butai could mount raids, but it could not project sustained power ashore. This meant that Japanese ground forces, even if they managed to stay ashore, would probably lack consistent air cover while trying to conduct offensive operations, not a good recipe for ultimate success. It is true that if the Hawaiian Islands couldn't be captured, the Japanese might have tried blockading them instead, using a combination of submarines and surface forces. But Japanese doctrine looked down on commerce raiding, and as a result, their subs never proved as effective in this role as they might have been. For their part, Japanese surface forces couldn't hope to operate in the face of American land-based air power without Kid Butai to support them. Yet the presence of Japanese carriers in the area would have necessarily been sporadic. Even in the face of a concerted blockade, it is almost impossible to imagine the Americans being willing to sacrifice the garrison and the large civilian population there. If maintaining the logistical flow to the islands necessitated sustaining Murmansk-like losses in the supply convoys, so be it, but the convoys would still have been sent. America was engaged in a total war, and failure was not an option. just as the British had risen to the London Blitz and defended Malta in the Mediterranean, and the Russians had endured the seemingly endless siege of Leningrad, so too would the Americans have been determined to hang on to Oahu, their last outpost in the Pacific. The only logical conclusion one can reach from all this is that Hawaii was largely impregnable. Its value as an American naval base might have been diminished in the short term, but the islands themselves most likely could never have been taken. The wider ramifications of a Japanese victory at Midway are less easy to gauge. It is certainly true that the American counteroffensive at Guadalcanal would never have been launched under such circumstances. Australia and New Guinea would likewise have been in greater danger as a result of America's inability to forestall continued Japanese incursions. Barring the successful occupation of Hawaii, the Japanese certainly would have moved into the South Pacific largely unimpeded, occupying the New Hebrides, Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. It is possible that they would have contemplated landings in northern Australia as well. In the short term, then, the Allied position in this area of operations would have been made much more precarious. But it is unclear whether the Japanese really could have used the time that a victory at Midway would have purchased to good effect. No amount of territory that Japan captured in the South Pacific could solve its basic strategic problems. Taking Tonga, or even Brisbane, couldn't bring the Americans to the negotiating table. It couldn't forestall the inexorable completion of the naval forces then building in America's shipyards. Nor could it help Japan build her own carriers any faster. One thing that the breathless proselytizers of Midway doomsday scenarios always fail to note is that in all the territory Japan had added to her empire since December 1941, there was not a single production centre worthy of the name. Whereas the Germans had benefited significantly from capturing such complexes as the Skoda Arms works in Czechoslovakia, the factories around Paris and in the Rhône-Alpes region, and the shipyards in Brest and Saint-Nazaire. No comparable facilities existed anywhere in Asia. Apart from Japan and the United States, there wasn't a single shipyard in the Pacific capable of launching a warship larger than a destroyer. The only decent dry dock anywhere south of Kaiesh was located 2,700 miles away in Singapore. Thus, Japan's conquests contributed practically nil to her industrial capacity. Likewise, the raw materials that Japan secured in the East Indies still had to be transported home and turned into finished products. Not only that, but Japan's own industrial base had already been largely maxed out during the heated military expansions of the 1930s. In contrast to the American economy, which had been underutilized during much of the same time period, and thus had plenty of unused capacity, Japan had no such headroom for significant growth. Worse still, there is credible evidence to suggest that absorbing the lower per capita GDP regions like the East Indies represented a significant hindrance to efficiently mobilizing the Japanese economy. Thus, both militarily and economically, territorial indulgences like taking the Solomons or Fiji were ultimately futile, in that they extended the Japanese defensive perimeter for little real gain. There was nothing in the South Pacific worth capturing from a resource standpoint, and those garrisons would have to be manned and supplied, thereby stretching Japan's already fragile logistical resources even further. Taken as a whole, it is arguable that the Japanese sticking their necks out even further would merely have left them that much more exposed when the inevitable American hammer blows began in 1944. Likewise, while invading northern Australia would have been a blow to Allied fortunes and would have potentially deprived them of a useful base in the short term, in the long term it is difficult to see how such a move could have measurably improved Japanese fortunes. In the first place, the Australians had several superb infantry formations of their own. It is likely that they could have held their shores against the invader, or at least inflicted very serious casualties on them. After all, the Australians, unlike the British in Malaya, would have been fighting for hearth and home. Second, it seems equally unlikely that the Japanese could have occupied the entire subcontinent, meaning that Sydney, Perth, and probably even Brisbane couldn't have been brought effectively under Japanese control. Third, It has to be admitted that while Australia was a useful base for the Allied counter-offensive, it wasn't vital in the same way that holding Britain was for conducting operations against the continent of Europe. As the Americans were to demonstrate in 1944 in the Central Pacific, they had the means to punch directly through the heart of Japanese defences and make their way toward the home islands. Nothing that happened at Midway in 1942 could change the overall parameters of that equation come 1944. Overall, it seems clear that much of the wild speculation regarding the possible negative effects of an American loss at Midway is unwarranted. As we have seen, the American strategic position in the Pacific could be damaged, but not irretrievably so, for the simple reason that Hawaii could never have been taken away. In contrast, there's no question that in the short term, such a defeat would have carried heavy penalties, particularly with regard to the South Pacific and Australia. The war might have been lengthened somewhat, but in the long term, the Americans were in a truly unique position of strength. The US economy was already more than 6 times larger than that of Japan at the outbreak, and would expand by 50% during the war. More important, US industry was essentially immune to Japanese attack. The American naval building program could not be forestalled, meaning that Admirals Ernest King and Chester Nimitz knew with absolute certainty that their naval power was going to be decisively superior to that of Japan in the relatively near future. This raises the final conundrum surrounding the true meaning of winning or losing at Midway. Since the day the battle was fought, the American victory there has been labelled as being decisive. But the foregoing analysis has shown that win or lose at Midway, it was extremely unlikely that the Americans were going to lose the war in the Pacific, and it was equally unlikely that the Japanese were going to win. How, then, can such a battle be considered decisive? As H.P. Wilmot pointed out, there is a basic contradiction in simultaneously thinking that the Americans were bound to win the war and that the Battle of Midway was decisive. To be decisive, Midway had to be a defeat from which the Japanese could not recover, of the sort, for example, that the Japanese inflicted on the Russians at Tsushima. But that was clearly not the case, Wilmot notes, given the vigorous Japanese naval actions later in 1942 around the Solomons. Midway might also be termed decisive if it had completely altered the course of the war, but that also seems untrue. If the defeat of Japan was assured because of the disparity of national resources, Midway was at best only a milestone on the road that led to defeat. It was not a signpost that marked a parting of the way, one track leading to American victory and the other in precisely the opposite direction. This leads back to the logical contradiction in asserting simultaneously that Midway was a decisive battle and that American victory was inevitable, because the notion of an inevitable victory is irreconcilable with that of a decisive battle. If Midway merely hastened by some months a foregone conclusion to the conflict that still lay some years in the future, as seems to be the case, then it cannot legitimately be termed decisive. Arguing that the outcome of the war in the Pacific was inevitable is not suggesting that the defeat of the Axis powers in WWII was likewise guaranteed. Richard Overy's superb Why the Allies Won vigorously refutes the economic determinist stance regarding WWII, showing just how many critical hinge points there were in that conflict. His study and others render highly dubious any assertion that an Allied victory over the Axis as a whole was inevitable. This is because the real strategic locus of the war as a whole lay not in the Pacific, but rather in Europe generally, and on the steppes of Russia in particular. Victory in the European theatre was far chancier for the Allies, given the immense collective economic strength of Nazi Germany and her satellite assemblage of Allied and conquered territories. It would not be until Russia's survival was assured, in late 1942, that the war in Europe began to veer away from the brink of disaster. But paradoxically, within the more limited context of the Pacific War, it was absolutely certain that the Allies, chiefly represented by the United States, would ultimately defeat the sole Axis power in the region, Japan. The reasons for this are twofold. The first was one of simple geography. Germany was in no position to assist Japan militarily in any substantial sense, even if it had wanted to. Thus, a German victory in Europe was not necessarily a guarantor of Japan's ultimate security. The second, more important reason was America's enormous advantages in productive capacity relative to that of Japan. Indeed, this basic fact was well understood by both parties, as an exchange immediately prior to the war between the American Chief of Naval Operations, ADM, Harold R. Stark, and Japan's Special Ambassador to the United States, ADM. Nomura Kichisaburo illustrates. With war clouds gathering, Stark remarked to Nomura, "If you attack us, we will break your empire before we are through with you. While you may have initial success, the time will come when you too will have your losses, but there will be this great difference. You will not only be unable to make up your losses, but will grow weaker as time goes on, while on the other hand we will not only make up our losses, but will grow stronger as time goes on. It is inevitable that we shall crush you before we are through with you." Stark's comments precisely foretold the long-term strategic dynamics that would play out in the war that Japan would shortly initiate. Indeed, if anything, he understated the case, as Japan's ruinous, almost pre-industrialized post-war economic situation vividly demonstrated. It is true that this inevitable victory might not have occurred if the American will to victory had flagged. In light of modern defeats in places like Vietnam, Beirut, and Mogadishu, it is fashionable these days to question whether the American populace in WWW2 would have had the determination to see the war through to a successful finish in the face of something like a Japanese victory at Midway. However, this notion is unsupportable, being based on a post-war mindset that did not pertain during 1942. In the first place, drawing parallels between defeats in Lebanon, Somalia, and Vietnam is not germane. These were all optional wars, for want of a better phrase. The American public knew that, win or lose, nothing that happened on those battlefields necessarily affected the global security of America, or would have a dramatic impact on their way of life. The same most certainly cannot be said of World War II. Once France fell, Britain was attacked, and then the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the American public somberly grasped the fundamental magnitude and importance of the struggle before them. The knowledge that this was total war, fought against evils of an appalling and absolute nature, pervaded the country. It steeled the collective resolve of the nation and prepared it for massive sacrifices of blood and treasure in ways that are lost on generations raised during and after Vietnam. World War II was fought by a generation that had grown up in full knowledge of the horrendous sacrifices that had been made in World War I. People of that era understood the level of effort that would be required. No one was under any illusions that they were in for anything other than a long, bitter, and bloody war. And so indeed it proved. In the end, Midway stands as the most important battle of the Pacific War, not because it was decisive in an absolute sense, and not because it won the war in a day, but because of its immediate practical effects on American military options in the Pacific. In the succinct words of the Naval War College study of the battle, Midway put an end to Japanese offensive action and restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific. In this modern era of unchallenged American naval supremacy, merely restoring parity may not seem like much of an accomplishment, but it must be recalled that Midway was fought between one navy at the peak of its strength and another, if not at its nadir, then close to it. In the dark months of 1942, being able to claw back to parity was an enormous achievement. Thus, Midway clearly delineated where and when the strategic momentum in the Pacific War shifted over to the Americans. The Battle of Coral Sea had provided the first hints that the Japanese high-water mark had been reached, but it was the Battle of Midway that put up the sign for all to see. Midway also marked the gateway to the attritional war that would be fought in the Solomons, a campaign that would irreparably ruin the Japanese Navy by destroying its elite naval aviation cadres and wrecking its surface forces beyond redemption. Midway didn't produce these consequences by itself, but it created the circumstances whereby the Japanese Navy would be fed into the shredder. As was stated in the introduction, all great battles inevitably create their own mythos. That is, every battle of note is comprised of a series of significant moments that provide a framework for understanding the outcome of the battle as a whole. They are the crucial, causative events that people look at and say, "Oh, so this is why things turned out as they did." Such a mythos clarifies and simplifies actions that are invariably messy, complex, and almost incomprehensibly violent. The present account, it is true, is a revisionist one, in that it disputes many of the beliefs regarding the Battle of Midway that have been in print for the last 60 years or so. It's appropriate, then, to end by briefly re-examining some of the conventional wisdom and then attacking the last and greatest of the misconceptions that is still attached to this battle. The issues addressed so far include the following. At the time of the decisive American dive bomber attack at 10:20–10:25 on 4th of June, the Japanese carriers were just minutes away from launching a decisive counterattack against the American carriers. This is categorically not true and is one of the biggest fallacies in the conventional Japanese account. At the time of the decisive attack, the Japanese were at least a half-hour away from being able to launch a strike, and few, if any, Japanese attack planes were on deck. The Aleutians operation was an elaborate feint designed to lure the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor. Not true. The simultaneous launch of operations in the Aleutians was designed to capitalize on the Americans being busy elsewhere, so that objectives in the Aleutians could be seized without hindrance. Operation AL was an invasion in its own right, strategically timed, and not merely a diversion. During the transit to Midway, Admiral Yamamoto withheld important intelligence from Admiral Nagumo that might have changed the course of the battle. As a result, Nagumo was in the dark concerning the nature of the threat facing him at Midway. Not true. While Yamamoto did not communicate to Nagumo, there was no need to, as Kid Butai was perfectly capable of independently receiving timely intelligence from the 1st Communications Unit in Tokyo. Akagi's intelligence estimate before the battle reveals that Nagumo had most of the important pieces of information already in hand. What is less clear is why he did not act on that intelligence. Had the Japanese implemented a two-phase search plan on the morning of 4th of June, they would have succeeded in locating the American fleet in time to win the battle. Perhaps, but in 1942 the Japanese and Americans had yet to incorporate the notion of a two-phase search into their doctrine. Such a search plan was never an option, and it was disingenuous for Fuchida Mitsuo to imply that it was. The late launch of Cruiser Tone's scout plane doomed Admiral Nagumo's efforts to win the battle. Not true. If anything, Tone No. 4's late launch and subsequent improvised search route led to the discovery of the Americans earlier than ought to have been expected. The true failures in scouting during the battle began with the failure of Japan's submarines to arrive on station on time, followed by the abandonment of Operation K, and culminated with Chikuma No. 1's failure to locate the Americans in the 615 time frame. Had Nagumo not decided to rearm his aircraft with land attack weapons, he would have been in a position to attack the Americans as soon as they were discovered. Not true. The reserve strike aircraft were not spotted on the flight deck when the Americans were detected. Given the time required to spot the decks, Nagumo's odds of launching an attack before Tomonaga's return were low at best. The ceaseless American air attacks had destroyed any reasonable possibility of spotting the decks before Tomonaga's return because of the constant launch and recovery of Combat Air Patrol, CAP, fighters. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 was not in vain, since it pulled the Japanese CAP fighters down to sea level, thereby allowing the American dive bombers to attack. Not true. VT-8's demise happened a full hour before the decisive attack, giving plenty of time for the Cap Zeros to resume their correct stacking had they maintained discipline. Rather, VT-8's contribution was the same as VT-6's, disrupting the counter-offensive activities of the Japanese carriers. The Japanese Naval Air Corps was all but wiped out at the Battle of Midway. Not true. Japanese casualties at Midway amounted to fewer than a quarter of the aviators embarked. Rather, it was the attritional campaign in the Solomons that destroyed the elite corps of Japanese naval aviators. However, the most pernicious myth concerning the Battle of Midway has never been seriously questioned, even though evidence to the contrary was readily available. The continuance of this myth suggests that it fits conveniently into the glorification of this, possibly the greatest U.S. naval victory of all time. Appealing as the myth is to any historian who becomes involved in studying Midway, its attractiveness must not outweigh a careful cross-checking of sources and a dispassionate evaluation of the factual evidence. The myth in question is the persistent belief that in defeating the Japanese, the Americans miraculously triumphed against overwhelming odds. With no disrespect intended toward the late Walter Lord, who generously assisted the authors in the creation of this work, the foreword to his otherwise very laudable incredible victory nevertheless encapsulates this belief as eloquently as anything else in print. By any ordinary standard, they were hopelessly outclassed. They had no battleships, the enemy 11. They had 8 cruisers, the enemy 23. They had 3 carriers, one of them crippled. The enemy had 8. They had no right to win. Yet they did, and in doing so, they changed the course of a war. More than that, they added a new name, Midway, to that small list that inspires men by shining example. Like Marathon, the Armada, the Marne, a few others, Midway showed that every once in a while what must be need not be at all. Even against the greatest of odds, there is something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valour, that can lift men from certain defeat to incredible victory. Lord certainly didn't invent this notion, but he articulated a general post-war attitude that has been echoed endlessly in almost every American text on the battle until it has been accepted as Holy Writ. It is a conviction that has been subtly reinforced by the very titles of the 2 most important English-language histories of the battle miracle at Midway, and Incredible Victory, and less subtly amplified by numerous TV documentaries, by every talk given at a WW2 veterans group, and by hundreds of internet discussions that have self-referentially reinforced the notion. It has gotten so out of hand, in fact, that historian John Lundstrom has jokingly coined a phrase to describe it, incredible victory disease. However, the notion that Midway was somehow a miraculous triumph, fought in the face of crushing Japanese superiority, is a fallacy, and one greatly in need of dispelling. Furthermore, it is a fallacy that can be easily refuted at 2 different levels of analysis. First, by examining the opposing forces and their operational plans during the battle, and second, by analysing the command decisions of the 2 opposing supreme commanders, Yamamoto Isoroku and Chester Nimitz.